presidential election. This election was supposed to give Syria a united front in the eyes of the international community, which was not fooled because President Bashar al-Assad was meant to win. Yes, he did. He claimed 88.7% of the votes to get a third 7-year term in office. Election results was not very shocking. Looking at the ballot paper, President Assad had no worthy opponents. Even more interestingly, it seemed the people of Syria wanted him to win. Well, not exactly everyone in Syria was happy with the election results. Those living in Idlib province, northwest of the country, have condemned President Assad's re-election. They described it as a fraud. They say the relatively unknown and state-approved challengers had offered no real alternative and that no poll held in the middle of a war could be considered credible. Even if he, President Bashar al-Assad, is successful during his term as president, we will not leave Syria under his control, because Syria belongs to us, the people, not to him. The people will decide whether he stays or goes. We all expect the elections to be in his favor. No one voted for him. He had won before the elections took place. Syria belongs to us, and we will stay here to fight the thugs. And God willing, we will be rid of them very soon. Their feelings have been re-echoed by Syrians living in the Jordanian refugee camp in Sitara, who say they witnessed a mockery of an election committed by the Syrian regime. Many of those living in the camps closed down their shops in protest of the elections. Over in Europe, dozens of Syrians held a protest demonstration outside the European Parliament to condemn the June 3rd election. Back home, supporters of the Assad government hailed the election as exemplary. Crowds danced on the streets of Damascus to celebrate Assad's victory. Shortly after the announcement, President Assad made his first television appearance, holding a meeting with the head of the Iranian Committee for National Security and Foreign Policy, Aladdin Bourujedi. Hezbollah leader Syed Hassan Nasrallah on Friday said the victory meant his opponents can no longer call for his departure as a precondition to end the conflict. Attempts to end the conflict, which has turned to a sectarian civil war, have failed. Syria's opposition says Assad's resignation is a precondition for any future peace agreement. Syria's ally in Europe, Russia, said it considered the election free, fair and transparent. Russia has given Assad crucial backing during the conflict that has killed 160,000 people, providing arms and blocking Western and Arab-backed efforts to adopt UN Security Council resolutions to condemn him or threaten his government with sanctions. Meanwhile, violence continues, especially in Daraa province. On Saturday, tanks said to belong to rebels were seen advancing towards what was described in an amateur video as a Tal Jumu military base. The tanks were then seen shooting at the base, with smoke rising from a distant hill where the base is said to be situated. Another video showed shelling of what might be a building in the district of Al-Ashrafiyah in Aleppo, held by the government forces. The video showed several shells hitting the building, followed by blasts. The World Summit of Legislators on Climate Change held a meeting in Mexico this past weekend, and focus was on getting lawmakers to understand their role in getting governments to abide by agreements on climate change, especially in cutting their carbon emissions. Channel Television's Ayola Kasim was at that meeting.
The third day of what has been described as the largest ever gathering of lawmakers on sustainable development.
Ladies and gentlemen,
the legislators' resolution includes commitments to create the foundation for a new United Nations brokered global agreement in Paris 2015. It calls for a new generation of international agreement that places national legislation at its heart. The decisive intervention from legislators is based upon a growing recognition that the classic model of international governmental negotiations is no longer sufficient to deliver the necessary action to achieve a global climate agreement and meet the goal of limiting global average temperature rise to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels.
Whatever you agree in Paris has got to be carried through, and again, legislators are part of that. And recognising that and making it very clear that that's part of the system is what we want from the United Nations. Not because we've got any particular self-aggrandizement, but simply because the practicalities are that only parliaments and assemblies will deliver.
Heads of key United Nations institutions, the UN climate negotiations and the World Bank Group joined legislators during the summit as part of the Partnership for Legislation that will support lawmakers to develop, advance and implement laws on climate change, forests and natural capital accounting.
The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol had set a significant precedent as a means of solving a long-term environmental problem. But those have only been the first steps towards implementation of an international response strategy to combat climate change. Although the Kyoto Protocol's most notable achievements are the simulation of an array of policies and the creation of an international carbon market and new institutional mechanisms, its economic impacts are yet to be demonstrated. Now, the attention is focused on the UN negotiations that will help develop a new international climate change agreement that will cover all countries, not just the main emitters of carbon. The new agreement will be adopted in 2015 at the Paris Climate Conference, and implementation will begin from 2020. It will take the form of a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force, and will be applicable to all parties. A UK parliamentarian, John Prescott, outlines the importance of achieving this and the challenges.
Well, now we've got it till Paris in 2015. Now, what worries me about that, things have changed quite rapidly, and America was very anti at Kyoto, of course, and didn't want anything to do with it. And I always felt that the Americans would have great difficulty supporting any concept of Kyoto. Even the Japanese don't support Kyoto now because of a number of difficulties. So I thought that the next meeting at 2015 had to be somewhat different. The principles of the Kyoto Agreement would apply. One fundamental difference is the application of law. I don't believe the next agreement, which will probably be called the Paris Protocol or something, because it won't be Kyoto, and it will have the principles in it, but it will have great difficulty about imposing legal framework. So what I've been convincing Globe about, and which we've now put in a resolution here, that a combination of global agreement and using domestic legislation is the way forward. We have done that in Britain with the Climate Change Act. The Aussies have done the same under Labour governments, that if you want to change it, you have to bring in new legislation. You simply can't just come in and say, I'm not going to do it, as the Prime Minister found in Australia. So what we need is, first of all, the principles that are carbon level, and as we hear, and we're getting very much to that ceiling now, you still have to have a global understanding of that agreement. And I think we saw that in Doha when all countries agreed to set a certain level of carbons that they would accept. The trouble with the Kyoto one, there was no force to enforce it if you didn't observe it. That was always the great difficulty that we put in. There was no, unless somebody's got down to send in bloody NATO, they go in everywhere, don't they? So to enforce the agreement. So global part is to determine the carbon in line with the principles for the temperature we've established, and then follow the UN principle of negotiations to continue. But when it came to legal enforceability, you have to, what will we do? Every country, in our view, should have a statutory Climate Change Act, which you put in like we've done in Britain, you impose and govern it by domestic legislation. Now, that is, I think, is the way forward, and I think I'm strengthening that view by what the Americans and the Chinese are doing. Clearly, it's a new kind of G2, you know, where China and America have got together to agree to cut the carbon. What the rate of that is another matter, but at the moment they're agreeing that. But the important point is, as Obama has said, he cannot get Congress to agree a kind of overseas, what they call another global agreement. So he's now come out and said, I'll use my presidential powers, which we've argued for a time that he should use. But that is not the global agreement. It's not a globally enforceable agreement that has to go to the Congress. So he's doing it by presidential power, which is domestic legislation. China already was imposing domestic legislation and its own commitments in its white paper. Europe has took a different line, and that's what I was trying to point out today. The European leaders still seem to be of the mind that you have to have the Kyoto Global Framework, which means, presumably, the legal framework. Well, that is what the Kyoto 1 was, but it won't be what I call the Paris Protocol. And Europe has to change. And I think the chance for Europe, and this is for 2015, is to recognize that both China and America have come to an agreement which was within the domestic legal framework. Europe could do the same. Britain already has done that. And there lies the answer to get Europe to recognize that if it plays the negotiating role with the Americans and China, we can get another agreement, the Paris one admittedly, to follow on from Kyoto 1. Now that's the challenge, and I was trying to tell people today, go back to your own countries and ask them what the damn they're doing. And in Europe the biggest challenge is to get them to accept, and frankly, none of the leaders have been prepared to put their head up and say they are prepared to move from the Kyoto 1. And that's leading to a difficulty, but quite honest, I've talked to most of their advisors and their negotiators. They recognise this is the only way forward if we are to maintain a climate change agreement. So 2015 at Paris should be one, the combination of global, perhaps I should have said if you set a global target, you can't necessarily trust them to carry it out. So there has to be an independent body which then checks and reports annually whether the nation states are achieving what they set to reduce the carbon. Given that framework, we think that's the framework for the next agreement at Paris. Then you've got 4 years, as we had at Kyoto, to negotiate to 2020, all the bits and pieces that go to make an agreement and the carbon targets set for the 2030, 50, etc., which is the present case.
And this is where we end the program this week. Your thoughts, questions, and comments are always welcome. The address to reach us on are on your screen. I am Amarachi Ubani. Thanks for watching.